These projects and performances are not about methodical research in any particular reductive area, but rather they're aesthetic and artistic gestures and experiments. Marshall McLuhan in the 60s said that technology is the external organs of the body. So we know we have evolved as this soft body with internal organs, and now increasingly we're engineering external instruments and technologies to interface with the human body. So in this age of body hacking, gene mapping, prosthetic augmentation, organ swapping, face transplants, synthetic skin, what it means to be a body and what it means to be human, and what generates aliveness and agency becomes problematic. So in the spaces of these prosthetic bodies, partial life and artificial life, the body has become obsolete. It's inadequate in the technological terrain that it now performs. Between 1973 and 1975, I made 3 films of the inside of my body. This internal probing of the body made me realise, of course, that the body is not simply bounded by skin, but rather has an internal structure, internal empty spaces and cavities. It's a circulatory system, it's a nervous system. So it really made me conscious of the body as an internal and complex operating system. In some of my early projects, I was amplifying body signals and sounds, using brain waves, heartbeat, blood flow, muscle signals, EMG signals, not only acoustically amplifying the human body, but also using body signals as control signals, body signals to modulate, for example, the light installation. And here also laser beams were directed to the eyes with optic fibre cable, and by controlling the muscles around the eyes, you could literally scribble in the space. You could generate images. The eyes were not simply passive receptors of light, but actively constructing images. In the partial head project, which is a kind of partial portrait of the artist, we scanned the artist's face, we scanned a hominid skull. We then did a digital transplant of the human face over the hominid, getting this composite image. Using that data, we 3D printed a scaffold and then grew a layer of living skin. So this partial head, this partial portrait of the artist was also partially living for several days before it got contaminated and had to be fixed in formaldehyde for the rest of the exhibition. The third hand was the first addition or augmentation to my body. It was sophisticated enough at the time when it was completed in 1980 to get invitations to the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena and the Johnson Space Center in Houston to demonstrate the hand to the extravehicular activity group. Only 3 degrees of freedom, but it also had a tactile feedback system for a sense of touch. And this was an EMG controlled hand, so signals from the stomach and legs enabled independent control of the three hands. Originally, it was just a visual attachment to the body. You know, what is it like to perform with a body with an additional hand? And so there were various performances that were, I guess, more about movements and actions with an additional appendage. But I did learn to write with three hands, and in this performance I'm writing one word, evolution. Each hand is writing a separate letter at the same time. I had to keep my two eyes on what my three hands were doing, and because this performance was done on a sheet of glass between the artist and the audience, I had to also learn to write back to front. I only learned to write two words, evolution and decadence, because these were both 9-letter words. The extended arm was more than a hand. It lengthened my arm to primate proportions. So I had a very, very long right arm with an additional joint. It was 11 degrees of freedom. But whilst my right arm was extended with the manipulator, my left arm was involuntarily moving, pre-programmed using a muscle stimulation system. We streamed this performance live. This was in 2000. And we had a 3D model of the manipulator. And this 3D model mimicked the movements of the actual manipulator. So online, you could see the body performing. You could also see the 3D model mimicking the movements of the manipulator. And this was for 4 hours continuously. This performance began when the body was switched on, and the performance ended when the body was switched off. I'm sort of going backwards in time now, and this was in 1995, where instead of the body simply being programmed in a local space, it didn't take much to figure out that you could do this remotely. This is the muscle stimulation control box. The blue switches indicate which parts of your body could be pre-programmed. And we had made a simple 3D model of a human body by touching the muscles on the computer model. The model would simulate your movements that you've programmed, and then a second later in Luxembourg, where my body was, my body moves involuntarily. So people in the Pompidou Centre in Paris, the Media Lab in Helsinki, the Doors of Perception Conference in Amsterdam, for example, were able to remotely access and remotely activate my body elsewhere. There were malicious agents out there who, not really believing in the system, would program the same movements over and over again. This performance was for 2 days, 6 hours every day, so it became rather fatiguing after a while. Ping body, here we used ping protocol, pinging 40 global sites during the performance. The reverberating pings measured in milliseconds were mapped to the body's muscles. So instead of people in other places remotely activating the body, here, internet data, the body here becomes a kind of crude barometer of internet activity. Parasite was the other online performance where we customized a search engine to scan the internet, select anatomical images from the web. These were shown in my head-up display. The images were analysed, and the complexity of that image determined the complexity of my movements. So the image that I see is the image that moves my body. This performance was done in Tokyo at NTT ICC. It was also performed elsewhere in Glasgow, for example, in Sydney as well. And Parasite was a performance also where I did live video switching and video mixing. I had tilt sensors on my arms, legs, and head. So as my body moved involuntarily, it would switch the video image from the 4 different cameras. So the body here is cinematically generating the images that were projected beside it. And in this sort of age of mixed realities, you know, the body performs beyond the boundaries of its skin and beyond the local space that it inhabits. We're no longer merely biological bodies performing in proximity. We're always elsewhere. We're always in at least 2 places at once. We're in an offline and an online world simultaneously. The ambidextrous arm was one that I initiated at Brunel University in London, and I wanted to come up with a kind of a universal manipulator which is human-like in its capabilities. So imagine a hand, an arm, where the fingers can bend one way, the thumb can rotate, you have a right hand, but the fingers can bend completely the other way, the thumb can rotate backwards, you have a left hand and a right hand, all in the one design. So if you're an amputee and you lost your right hand, why not replace it with an ambidextrous hand? Sometimes 2 left hands might be better to perform some tasks than left hand and a right hand. And the idea too was also to embed a webcam in the palm of the hand. So this would also be a disembodied eye, so an eye in hand. It was just simply some early testing, just using a keyboard, but just indicating how the fingers can be truly ambidextrous in their function. At Curtin University, in collaboration with mechanical engineering and another PhD student, we developed an orthosis, an actuated orthosis, which could, on the one hand, be used as a robot controller, which I wanted it to be used for, but also to animate a paralysed hand. So the person would wear this orthosis, the linear actuators would produce an opening and closing function, very simple one, but very useful one for someone who has a paralysed hand. This was totally 3D printed. So with 3D printing, for example, with a child's hand or a female hand or a male hand, you can easily scale the dimensions in your 3D model, and you can 3D print overnight an articulated orthosis, and all you need to do is attach the linear actuators and you have a functional device to animate a paralysed hand. All of these projects are exploring alternative anatomical architectures that sort of go beyond mere biomimicry. So, you know, why not 3 hands? Or why not 6 legs? Why not an extra ear? What kind of possibilities in bodily capabilities can you generate from these? Exoskeleton was a 6-legged walking robot developed whilst I was in Hamburg with F-18, and this was robust enough and strong enough to support the artist's body. The artist's upper body exoskeleton enabled me to select the walking movements through my arm gestures. So the robot could walk forwards with a ripple gait, sideways with a tripod gait. The robot could squat, it could stand, it could turn on the spot. And you could select these walking movements through your arm gestures and with the controller that you held. This performance was simply taking the robot for a walk. You know, what was it like walking with 6 legs? And this was the first performance where I was fully dressed. The performance involved standing on the robot that was really hitting the concrete ground very hard, sending shock waves through my body. I couldn't stand on the robot naked. It was suggested that I wear shockproof boots. But wearing shockproof boots, I thought it prudent to also wear some clothes. Muscle Machine was a 6-meter diameter robot. So 6 meters, very, very large walking machine. The body here could actuate the movements simply by stepping up and down on the spot with encoders on its joints. So by lifting my leg, 3 robot legs lift and swing forward. So by stepping up and down, this robot could walk. Because there were 3 legs always on the ground, it was always stable. And so here you're translating human bipedal gait into this 6-legged walking locomotion. The walking head robot was an autonomous robot, 2 meters in diameter, with a monitor displaying a human head. It had a rotating ultrasound sensor positioned at the front of the robot, which detects if someone is in the room. If the robot detects you in front of it, the robot stands, selects from its library of possible performances, and then plays that program for about 1.5 minutes. And when the robot finishes, it sits down, goes to sleep, and waits for the next person to be detected. So the intent actually was to engineer an actual virtual system where the mechanical movements of the legs would modulate the facial behavior of the head. A project that hasn't been completed, simply a 3D visualization of it. But imagine a small robot, insect-like, with a webcam mounted on it that was small enough and robust enough to climb up my tongue and into my mouth, I would just have to be careful not to swallow it. But the idea here is really a kind of an idea that indicates an increasing intimacy between the body and its technology. Technology will no longer merely be external to the body. Increasingly now, we're not only attaching or sticking circuitry to our skin, but now in micro-miniaturized and nanoscaled form, we'll be able effectively to recolonize the human body, to augment our bacterial and viral populations. We have no adequate internal alert warning system that something wrong is happening at a cellular level. When the symptoms surface, when you feel the lump in your chest, it's too late, the cancer has spread, the cancer is metastasized. But imagine nanoscaled sensors that might detect the first beginnings of a pathological grouping of cells. They would be more easily targeted and eradicated. What interests me with these technologies, with robots, with exoskeletons and with prosthetic attachments is what minimum vocabularies of behavior, what choreographies of movement can generate a sense of aliveness. Sometimes very few. You know, if you blink, if you smile, this might be enough to suggest an aliveness where none in fact exists. We can now instantly create hyperreal skins by either scanning a person's face or using photogrammetry, using multiple cameras with the software stitching together to make the 3D model. And then we can animate these skins. So at an audio-visual level, at a level of a screen, you truly will not be able to distinguish whether it's an actual person at the other end or simply a 3D model that simulates that person's behavior and voice. So increasingly now, the body experiences itself as a kind of phantom flesh. Okay? We all now have digital doubles that are online. Increasingly now, our biometrics, our biodata is collected and posted online. All of this stuff at the moment is incomplete, but increasingly now our physical bodies will be translated into phantom doppelgangers, and these phantoms will not be simply phantasmatic, but rather acting more like phantom limbs with increasing haptic feedback. In 1993, I designed a sculpture for the inside of my body. This sculpture, when it was fully closed, was in a capsule configuration so that it could be inserted down the esophagus into my stomach cavity. When it was inside the stomach, the sculpture could open and close, could extend and retract, had a flashing light and a beeping sound. So it was this simple machine choreography inside a wet and normally, well, not normally empty, but the stomach had to be empty and had to be inflated with air to allow us to do this performance. So this was done for the 5th Australian Sculpture Triennale, whose theme was site-specific works. But instead of a sculpture for a public space, this is a sculpture for a private physiological space. So here the body is not a site for the psyche, nor for social inscription. Here the body is a site for a work of art. A project that I completed with another artist, Nina Sellers, a kind of a more radical construct of an alternate anatomy, where both artists underwent liposuction to extract 4.6 litres of biomaterial from their bodies. This biomaterial was inserted in an installation titled Blender. Blender was the kind of inverse of the stomach sculpture. So instead of a machine sculpture inside a soft body, here a machine installation is the host for a liquid body composed of biomaterial from two artists' bodies. And the installation is sort of anthropomorphic in scale. It's about the height of the artists. And it has sensors in its chassis. So when anyone approaches the installation, the sensors will set off the blender blades. And so if you're close to the sculpture, the blender blades animate the biomaterial from the two artists' body, a kind of liquid body in a host of this technological installation. It generates some thinking about what is now possible. We're now able to engineer artificial wombs. At the moment, only for animals, but technically this would be possible to engineer an artificial womb to bring an embryo and a fetus to a fully healthy child. If we could engineer an artificial womb, then your life would begin without birth. And if we can replace malfunctioning parts of your body with stem cell grown organs, 3D printed parts, or artificial organs, then biologically there may not be a need to die. So how would you define your human existence if it doesn't begin with birth and it doesn't end with a biological death? The body that you're born with is probably not the body that you're going to die with. The Extra Ear project was a project that began as an idea in 1996. It was initially imaged as an ear on the side of my head. But this was a very difficult project to realise, and I could never convince any surgeons to construct an ear there. It's not an anatomically safe place. You might end up with partial face paralysis. But in 2006, after 10 years of consultation, we did find three plastic surgeons, to begin the construction of the ear on my arm, a much safer place to construct an extra ear. The scaffold is a porous biomaterial, and when this scaffold is inserted beneath the skin, when the skin is suctioned over the scaffold, over a period of 6 months, you have tissue ingrowth and vascularization occurring. In other words, the ear becomes fully a part of your body, a living part of your body. It has its own blood supply, and this ear now is not simply an ear that is replicating a facial object. Rather, the idea, and in this second surgery, we did insert a small microphone inside the ear construct. And even though my arm is wrapped with bandage and with a partial plaster cast, even though the surgeon has a face mask, you'll see him speaking to the arm, to the ear. His voice is picked up and wirelessly transmitted. So the idea with this project is not simply to replicate an ear and relocate it to my arm, but rather to internet enable the ear, to electronically augment the ear, so this ear is an accessible and remote listening device for people in other places. When I showed this to my 2-year-old niece, I wasn't sure whether she would recognize it was an ear, but the first thing she did was she grabbed my face and turned my head to see if this ear had slipped off. It did lead to these other projects. So this is a 4 meter long sculpture of the ear on my arm, first exhibited at the Sculpture Space in Melbourne, but also exhibited at the Lawn Sculpture Biennale, where I also performed lying on the sculpture. My body is covered in white clay to make it more a part of the sculpture, and I just simply lay there for the performance. But whilst I was on this arm, I thought it might be really interesting, instead of just lying on the arm, to suspend my body above the ear-on-arm sculpture. But what I decided to do was to suspend my body above the sculpture. We inserted 16 hooks into the skin of my back. The body was hoisted above the sculpture, and when the cables take the full weight of the body, because the cables are braided, the cable begins to untwist and the body begins to spin. Firstly in one direction and then in the other direction. I thought it would spin for about 5 minutes. Unfortunately, it spun for about 15 minutes. And this performance began when the body was hoisted off the sculpture, and it ended when the body was lowered down. In Propel, though, my body was attached to the end of an industrial robot arm. And in this way, we could precisely program the trajectory, the velocity, and the position and orientation of the body in the space. This was only a 30-minute performance. Sound is very important. When the performance of the body was finished, the body was replaced by a full-size sculpture of the ear. What's interesting is that the robot that choreographs the movements of the ear is also the same robot that carved the ear. The robot effectively was a 6 degree of freedom CNC machine. So increasingly now we're coupled and complicit with technology, and the body becomes this extended operational system. The body performs remotely, and the body performs augmented by instruments, machines, computational systems. So for me, there was always a ghost in the machine, but not as a vital force that animates, but rather as a fading attestation of the human. Stickman is a full body and minimal exoskeleton that algorithmically actuates the body for a 5-hour performance. But we also engineered a mini Stickman, so people who visited the gallery could manipulate the limbs of the mini Stickman, press play, and insert their choreography into the performance, a kind of electronic voodoo. And this performance was done in Perth. Sensors on the exoskeleton generated the signals that made the sounds that you hear. So the sounds not only register the movements of the exoskeleton, but really compose the acoustical score that you hear. Although the body's actions were involuntarily prompted by the algorithm, so the artist doesn't know what's going to happen next. Having said that, the body can balance on one leg and can modulate its shadow and the video feedback that was projected. So it was also partly involuntary, partly improvised, partly pre-programmed. So in these liminal spaces of proliferating prosthetic bodies, partial life and artificial life, the body has become this kind of floating signifier. The exoskeleton arm was engineered for the ReWired remixed performance. And in this performance, for 5 days, 6 hours every day, I could only see with the eyes of someone in London. I could only hear with the ears of someone in New York. But anyone, anywhere, could access my right arm and move it involuntarily. So it was kind of like outsourcing your senses and sharing your agency. The performance I'm going to show is a more recent one, which was 4 days, 5 hours every day.
Vielleicht zum Schluss noch von mir noch Fragen.
Between Basel and Eindhoven.
Ganz fest. Ja.
Ich habe nur 1 zu 1.
1 zu 1.
I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what I was going to see, what I was going to hear. So the touch screen in the gallery was prioritized. So if you interacted in the gallery space, you could see immediately your interaction. Online, you had to be queued because often you had multiple people trying to access it at the same time. And the most recent project is the Reclining Stickman project for the Biennale of Australian Art, and this was just recently completed. It was a 9-metre long robot. You can see the size of my body positioned on the robot. This was done using pneumatic rubber muscles. This is the website interface, so you can access the robot and remotely activate it through this website, recliningstickman.stelarc.org. So I could control the movements using these pneumatic joysticks and improvising and interacting with people who were in the gallery who were also inputting their information, and at the same time occasionally someone online connecting and choreographing the robot as well. This is the live video streaming. So the pneumatic rubber muscles are actuators that provide a flexibility and a compliancy in this large robot. So it's not a completely rigid robot. Imagine a rubber tube that's reinforced. If you inflate it with air, with 2 or 3 bar of air pressure, it acts like a spring holding together the structure. But 7 bar of air pressure, the rubber muscle expands in girth, contracts 20% of its length, producing a strong pulling force. So here you have muscles expanding and contracting, or exhausting and extending. So the robot is actuated somewhat anatomically, somewhat similar to our muscles that contract and shorten to produce a bending movement, or extend to allow the arm to go back to its original position. So the body on the robot, you know, the reclining robot or the reclining figure is an image that is very much a part of art history. The body on the robot, it's a kind of conjures up an image of a mother and child, or a pieta, and these are the images that are generated when you go to this performance. So to finish up, in 2011, the first twin turbine heart was inserted into the chest of a terminally ill patient. The patient lived long enough to fully test this new artificial heart, which is smaller, more robust, more reliable than any other previous artificial heart. The interesting thing is that it circulates the blood continuously without pulsing. So in the near future, you might rest your head on your loved one's chest. They're warm to the touch, they're breathing, they're speaking, they're certainly alive, they have no heartbeat. So this one piece of technology kind of radically redefines what we consider to be an aspect of being human. And what it means to be human is perhaps not to remain human at all. Being human means being curious, experimenting, not accepting the biological status quo in a Heideggerian sense, rather seeing the body as, yes, a very complex evolutionary structure, but rather a malfunctioning and inadequate design. So how can we better evaluate what a body is, what a body does, and consider ways of redesigning the human body, initially by augmenting it. And I think what artists do best is to generate contingent and contestable futures. In other words, possibilities that can be experienced, that can be interrogated, that can be evaluated, possibly appropriated, but most likely discarded. Thank you.